She was standing in front of the vineyard the day it stopped being mine on paper, even though it had never stopped being mine in any way that mattered. The morning light came in sideways off the water, the way it does in October in the valley, and the rows were just beginning to go gold and rust at the tips. I had driven up from Portland before dawn. I parked at the bottom of the gravel lane and sat in the car for a while with the engine off, watching the way the mist sat in the low places between the rows. I knew what was waiting for me at the top of the hill. I had known for 3 weeks. I got out anyway. Welcome back to Channel Name, where the quietest decisions leave the deepest marks. My name is Lena, and the vineyard at the top of that gravel lane had been in my family for 31 years before my mother signed it away without a word to me. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my grandmother had left something behind. Something that didn't expire. Something that was still sitting in a cedar box in the back room of the farmhouse, waiting for the right moment to speak. My brother was standing in the doorway when I came around the final bend. He had his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he was wearing a canvas jacket I recognized from the storage closet inside. It had been our father's. He stood in the threshold of the doorway like he was deciding something about me, like the geography of the entrance was already negotiated. I walked up the porch steps without slowing. I set the folder on the porch rail and asked him to read the second page. I watched his face while he did. He went very quiet after that. But I should start at the beginning because the beginning is the part that explains everything. My grandmother Opal bought the land in 1991, before the valley had become what it became. She paid $218,400 for 14 acres and a farmhouse that needed a new roof, and she spent the first 2 years learning the soil before she planted a single vine. That was who she was. She didn't move fast on things that mattered. She moved carefully. She moved with intention. She used to say that the land would tell you what it wanted if you sat still long enough to listen. I was 7 when she bought it. I spent every summer of my childhood there, and by the time I was 12 I could name every block by the taste of the soil at the root line. Block A was the old Madeline block, the one Opal had planted first, and it still had a slightly mineral finish that the other blocks never quite matched. Block C was the young Pinot block she put in after my grandfather died, and she had told me once, pulling leaves in the August heat, that she planted it because she needed something that was going to take a long time. My mother, Diane, was never comfortable in the vineyard. She was comfortable in the farmhouse, in the kitchen, in the front room with its particular afternoon light, but the vineyard itself made her restless. She didn't like the mud, the kneeling, the repetitive physical logic of the work. She didn't dislike the property. She liked what the property represented. That distinction would take me a long time to fully see. I moved to Portland at 23 to work in wine sales, and I drove back up to the valley every major harvest without exception. Not because anyone asked me to, because the harvest was something I needed to be present for the same way other people need to be present at a birth or a death. It was not optional for me. My grandmother understood that. I don't think my mother ever did. The phone call from Diane came on a Tuesday in late February, 3.5 years after Opal died. I was at my desk when she called, and I remember the specific quality of that afternoon. The thin winter light coming through the east window of my apartment, a cup of coffee going cold on the corner of the desk. She called at 2:14 in the afternoon, which I know because I glanced at my phone screen before I answered. She said she wanted to talk about the property. She said the family had been discussing it. She used that phrase, the family, as though it referred to a body of people who had all been consulted, though she did not name who. She said that the vineyard required more hands-on management than the current arrangement could support. She said this in the same tone she used when she explained decisions about household furniture, measured, explanatory, a tone that assumed the listener would naturally agree once the reasoning was laid out. "We've transferred the operational management," she said. "And the title, for clarity's sake, has been updated to reflect that." I let the sentence sit. "Which title?" I said. "The vineyard parcel. Your brother is the primary holder now." It was the most logical structure going forward. She said logical. She said going forward. She said primary holder as though these were terms from a sensible business document rather than the vocabulary of someone who had just handed my grandmother's land to my brother without a phone call, without a meeting, without a single word to me until it was already done. "When did this happen?" I said. The recording was completed in December. December. It was late February. The transfer had been recorded for nearly 3 months. I had been driving up to the valley in January to check on the irrigation lines in the frost, walking the rows in the cold, not knowing that the county already had a different name on file. I didn't say any of that. I said I would call her back. I let it sit. I sat at my desk for a long time after the call. The coffee was completely cold by then. I need to tell you about the deed, because the deed is the whole story. My grandmother Opal was meticulous about paperwork in the way that people who came up without much money often are. She kept records of everything, filed everything, and she had a system for the cedar box that sat on the shelf in the back room of the farmhouse. The box was cedar-lined and had a brass clasp that had gone slightly green at the edges. I had seen it my whole life. Opal used to open it once a year, always in January after the new year when the vineyard was dormant, and she would go through the contents methodically, the way you might service machinery that you depended on. The third summer after I started driving back for harvest, when I was 26, Opal asked me to sit with her while she did the January review. I don't know if she made a specific decision to include me that year, or if it happened organically. What I know is that she lifted the lid and went through the contents one by one. The original deed from 1991, the title insurance paperwork, the mortgage satisfaction letter from 2003, the annual tax receipts in a separate envelope, the water rights documentation, and at the bottom, in a separate sealed envelope that she had labeled in her own handwriting with the date, a second document. She held up the sealed envelope and looked at me. "This is the life estate provision," she said. "I had it drawn up when your father got sick. The attorney said it was the cleanest way to make sure the land went to the people who had worked it." I didn't know what a life estate provision meant at 26, not in the technical legal sense. Opal explained it to me in her own terms. It meant that the vineyard property could not be transferred, sold, or titled away from the named parties without their consent, regardless of any other document. The provision named 2 people. It named Opal. And it named me. She put the envelope back in the box. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because the land should know its own people." I remember that sentence for 11 years before I understood why she had said it the way she did. The labor of a vineyard is not romantic. I want to be exact about this, because the word vineyard carries a particular weight in people's minds: candlelight, bottles, afternoon meals in the sun. What the word does not carry is the specific weight of a pruning bucket after 4 hours in February cold, or the sound a shoot makes when you snap it wrong, or the number of times you walk a 14-acre property in a single day when something is wrong with the irrigation and you have to check every emitter by hand. I did all of it. From the summer I turned 23 until the year Opal died, I came back for every major harvest. After Opal died, I came back for everything. The harvest, yes, but also the pruning in February, the shoot thinning in May, the leaf pulling in July, the equipment checks before crush. I came back to walk the rows in January frosts to make sure the irrigation lines hadn't cracked. I came back in March to check the graphs on the new Syrah block that Opal had started the spring before she got sick. I drove 4 hours north and 4 hours south on weekends when I could have been anywhere else. I paid the property tax bill in 2019 because Diane said she had sent the check and the county records showed she hadn't, and I found out 3 days before the late penalty window closed. The bill was $7,340. I paid it from my own checking account and sent Diane a copy of a receipt. She said she would reimburse me. She did not. I paid it again in 2021, $7,612 that year, after the county reassessment, when Diane told me she was traveling in September and the bill had slipped through. I came back after the freeze in January 2022, when the temperature in the valley dropped to 18 degrees and Diane called me in a panic because she didn't know how to operate the frost protection system. I drove up at 4 in the morning. I got there in time to save the Madeline block. The Syrah block lost about 30% of its buds. That was a $23,400 loss at the eventual crush. I calculated it later because I had been tracking the block's yield for 4 years. In the spring of 2022, I found a crack in the main irrigation header that would have blown the entire Block C system by July if it had gone unaddressed. I hired the repair crew. The invoice was $4,870. I paid it. I kept the receipt. I kept every receipt. I kept every tax payment confirmation. I kept the contractor invoices and the equipment service records and the frost protection maintenance logs. I don't know exactly when I started keeping all of it so carefully. Maybe I always knew, in some place I didn't consciously examine, that the day would come when I would need to show exactly what I had given to that land. The summer my grandmother taught me to prune was the summer she also taught me to read the soil. She would kneel at the base of a vine and press 2 fingers into the ground and hold them there for a moment, and then she would say something specific. Not the soil is dry, but this block needs water at the root, not at the surface, so we open the emitter to 70% and we wait 2 days. Everything she said was specific. She didn't deal in generalities about the land the way people who don't work land often do. I was 14 that summer. I remember the weight of the pruning shears and the way the blade had to be held at a particular angle to make a clean cut rather than a crushing one. I remember Opal stopping me on my 3rd vine and adjusting the angle of my wrist without saying anything, just repositioning my hand the way you might tune an instrument. I remember the smell of the cut wood, green and slightly astringent, a smell I have never been able to explain to anyone who hasn't stood in a vineyard in February. That was the summer. She also showed me the property lines. We walked all 14 acres, twice over 2 days, and she explained each boundary marker and each parcel designation and the way the water rights attached to the lower eastern edge of the property. She explained why the eastern boundary mattered and what would happen if it were ever disputed. She was thorough in a way that, at 14, I didn't entirely understand. I understood later that she was teaching me to be a steward. She was not teaching my mother. She was not teaching my brother, who was 22 that summer and living in Seattle and had driven up exactly once to the vineyard since Opal had purchased it for a Christmas visit when I was 10. His name was Ryan. He had been absent from every harvest, every frost, every irrigation crisis, every tax bill for 31 years. He had driven up in October to stand in the doorway of the farmhouse in our father's jacket and look at me like he was deciding something about the geography of a space he had never worked a single day. There is something particular about the way my mother delivers bad news. She has always done it in the voice of reason, warm, measured, explanatory, as if the information is simply being communicated to you for your benefit and not deployed against you. She learned this, I think, from years of managing situations that didn't go the way she'd planned. She had turned the management of difficult information into a kind of bureaucratic hospitality. She offered you the bad news the way a thoughtful hotel manager might explain that your original room was no longer available, but here was the alternative, and wasn't it in many ways better? She used that voice when she told me my father was moving into memory care. She used it when she told me Opal's estate would take longer than expected to settle. She used it on the February phone call. She used it again in late August. I had driven up to the valley for the shoot thinning on the young Syrah block, work I had been doing for 3 years, work that Ryan had never once done, and Diane arrived at the farmhouse unannounced at 4 in the afternoon. I heard her car on the gravel lane from the vineyard, and I finished the row I was working before I walked in. She was in the kitchen making coffee, as though she had been expected. "I wanted to talk to you about the fall harvest," she said. I washed my hands at the sink. "Ryan is going to handle the crush this year," she said. "The winery contact has been updated to his information. I thought it was cleaner that way." I dried my hands on the dish towel that had hung on the oven handle since Opal's time. It was faded at the hem and had a pattern of small yellow birds. "He's never done a crush," I said.
"He's been learning," she said.
"He's talked to the winery. He's been up here more than you might think." I let it sit. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator made its particular low hum. Through the window above the sink, I could see the near edge of Block A, the Madeline block, the oldest vines on the property, the ones I had pruned every February for 11 years. "The deed transfer was recorded in December," I said. "Without telling me." "We discussed the need for clarity in the structure," she said. "You discussed it. With whom?" "With Ryan. And with the attorney." She set the coffee mug on the counter. She looked at me with something that was not quite an apology, and not quite its absence. Something between the two, a careful face. "The intention was never to diminish your contribution," she said. "You know how much the family values what you've done here." I looked at her for a moment. "Okay," I said. She waited for more. I didn't give her more. I excused myself and walked back out to the vineyard. I finished the Syrah block. I packed my tools into the truck bed while the light faded behind the ridge. I drove back to Portland without stopping. I did not tell her about the cedar box. I did not tell her about the sealed envelope with Opal's handwriting on it and the date in the lower right corner. I did not tell her that I had requested a copy of the full parcel history from the county recorder's office 3 weeks earlier when I first heard about the December transfer from a neighbor who had seen Ryan's name on the new listing documents. I let it sit. I pulled out the cedar box the night I got back to Portland. I had taken it, quietly, without ceremony, from the back room shelf the January after Opal died, when I drove up to check the frost lines and found the farmhouse unlocked and Diane in Olympia at a cousin's birthday. I had put the box in the back of my car under a folded moving blanket and driven it south without telling anyone. I didn't do it because I knew what was coming. I don't want to make myself more prescient than I was. I did it because the box was Opal's and I was afraid of what might happen to it if no one was paying attention. I opened the clasp and went through the contents the way Opal had showed me, methodically, in order. The original 1991 deed. The title insurance paperwork. The mortgage satisfaction letter, the annual tax receipts, the water rights documentation, and at the bottom, in the sealed envelope with the date in the lower right corner, the life estate provision. I unfolded it on my kitchen table and read it from the beginning. It was 4 pages. The first 3 pages were legal language, dense, technical, formatted with the numbered section headers that legal documents use. The 4th page was the signature page. My grandmother's signature was there, notarized, with a stamp dated March 14, 2011. And at the bottom of the 4th page, in a section labeled Named Parties, Protected Interest, were 2 names. Opal Frances Vanthorpe and Lena Marie Vanthorpe. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The building was quiet around me. A car went past on the street below. Someone in the apartment above me walked across the floor, and then the walking stopped. I read the provision's operative language 3 times. Then I turned to the 2nd page, where the specific mechanism was described. No conveyance, transfer, assignment, or encumbrance of the subject parcel shall be effective as against the protected interest of the named party, without the express written consent of said party, duly executed and notarized. My brother's name was not in the document. My mother's signature was not in the document. My consent had not been sought, obtained, or documented. The December transfer, as recorded, was not effective against my protected interest. I set the document on the table and looked at it for a while. Then I called an attorney named Carol Dryden, who had been recommended to me by a colleague in Portland who handled estate matters. I left a message at 11:30 at night. She called me back the next morning at 8:15. The floor is not yet met. Expanding now via flashback and labor inventory depth. No new scenes, no new escalation cycles. I want to tell you about the winter of 2020, because that winter is the one I keep coming back to when I try to understand how long I had been carrying the vineyard without anyone formally acknowledging that I was doing it. Opal had died in September of 2019. The estate was in probate, and Diane had taken on the role of executor with the same competent efficiency she applied to everything administrative. She was good at the paperwork portion. She was good at the calls to the attorney and the bank and the county assessor. What she was not good at, what she had never been good at, was the land itself, the physical work that the property required simply to stay alive between 1 year and the next. The vineyard does not pause for grief. That is something nobody tells you about land when you're deciding whether you want to be responsible for it. It does not know that someone died. The frost comes when it comes, and the irrigation emitters clog when they clog, and the canopy grows faster than it should in a wet spring regardless of what is happening inside the farmhouse. I drove up 3 weekends in November to do the first pass of dormancy pruning. Opal had always done this herself in the late fall, before the hard pruning in February, just to take the weight off the old wood before the freeze. Nobody asked me to do it. I did it because I knew it needed doing, and I knew nobody else was going to. In December, I came back for a day to reset the drip irrigation for winter mode, lowering the emitter heads to reduce frost exposure, checking the main line pressure. It took most of the day. Ryan was not there. Ryan was in Seattle. Diane was there for about 40 minutes in the afternoon, long enough to ask me if I thought the Syrah block was going to recover from the leaf mold problem we'd had in September. I said I didn't know yet. She said she hoped so. She drove back to Olympia that evening. I stayed and finished the irrigation work and drove home the next morning. In February of 2020, I did the full dormancy pruning, both the Madeleine block and the Pinot block, 14 acres, 3 weekends across the month. That is roughly 400 to 500 individual vines, each requiring inspection, the removal of dead or diseased wood, and a cut calibrated to the shape of the vine structure and the expected yield for the coming year. Opal had taught me to do it the way her own mentor had taught her. You don't just cut what's dead, you cut for what you want the vine to become. Ryan came up once in February. He stood at the end of a row for about 20 minutes while I worked. He asked me what I was doing. I explained the dormancy pruning. He nodded in a way that suggested he was storing the information rather than doing anything with it. He went inside after a while, and I heard him on the phone for a long time. I finished the block myself. In April, the shoot growth came in fast after an early warm spell, and I drove up for shoot thinning 3 weekends in a row. By the time the canopy had settled into its summer shape, I had spent 11 weekends of 2020 at the Vineyard, 22 days, if you count the full-day Friday arrivals, and I had done so without pay, without a formal agreement, and without a word from either Diane or Ryan acknowledging that the work was being done at all. I tracked my hours during those months, not because I intended to invoice anyone, because I needed, in some part of myself that I didn't examine too closely, to see the number written down. The number for 2020 alone was 214 hours of physical labor at the property. The attorney Carol Dryden had a small office in the Pearl District, 3rd floor, with a window that looked north toward the Fremont Bridge. I met with her on a Thursday morning in September. She had already pulled the Skagit County parcel records by the time I arrived. She had the December transfer deed on the table, and she had my copy of the life estate provision from Opal's cedar box, and she had a yellow legal pad with a column of notes that she walked me through methodically. The life estate provision, she said, was valid. It had been drafted by a licensed Washington state attorney, notarized correctly, and included language that met the current statutory standard for a protected life interest. The provision had not been filed with the county at the time Opal created it. Opal had kept it in the cedar box rather than recording it, but this, Carol explained, did not extinguish the interest. It meant the interest was unperfect, not non-existent. What needed to happen now was that the provision needed to be recorded. Once it's recorded, she said, the December transfer has a problem. A significant one. How significant? I said. The transfer cannot be effective against your interest without your written, notarized consent, which was not obtained. The county will have 2 conflicting claims on the parcel. She let that sit for a moment. The most direct resolution, she said, is a quiet title action. You file, you present the provision, you establish the prior interest. Given the documentation you've brought me today, I think the position is very strong. I asked her what I should do before filing. She said I should make sure I had copies of everything, the provision, all the tax payment records, any maintenance invoices, any expense records related to the property. I told her I had a folder. She looked at the folder I had brought, and then looked at me. How long have you been keeping these? She said. Since 2019, I said. Some from before that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. All right, she said. Let's go through them. I kept coming back, in those weeks after meeting with Carol, to a particular afternoon in the Vineyard with Opal. I must have been 11 or 12. It was late August, the week before school started, and the heat in the valley had been sitting at 90 degrees for 4 days. We were in the Madeleine block, checking the fruit set. Opal moved slowly along the row, lifting clusters with one hand and looking at them with a critical eye, checking for uneven ripening, for signs of mildew, for the thin-skinned berries that signaled the vine was stressed. She had a particular stillness when she did this work. She was not a small woman, but she moved in the vineyard without disturbing anything. That is the only way I know how to describe it. She stopped at a vine near the middle of the row. One of the clusters was developing unevenly, the top berries already beginning to soften and color, while the bottom third were still firm and green. She looked at it for a long time. This vine has been carrying too much, she said. I asked what we should do. She said we would thin it now, cut the compromised cluster back, so that the vine's energy could concentrate on what remained. Sometimes, she said, still looking at the cluster, the thing that's hurting you is also the thing that's been letting you carry everything. And you have to take it off before you can see what was actually there the whole time. I didn't know what she meant when she was 11 and standing in the August heat in the Madeline block. I filed the life estate provision on the morning of October 3rd, 11 years after that conversation, and I understood what she meant before the ink on the notary stamp was dry. The morning I filed the provision at the county recorder's office, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes after. The building was a low, beige county structure on the edge of the county seat, the kind of building that exists in every county in every state, functional, slightly depressing, impossible to feel anything particular about. But I sat in the parking lot, and I looked at the copy of the filed document in my hand, the one the clerk had stamped and dated and handed back to me through the window, and I felt something that was not triumph and not relief. It was closer to the feeling I had after the long winter of 2020 when I finished the last row of dormancy pruning at dusk and stood at the end of the block and looked at what I had done. Not relief. More like, the land is taken care of. That is all this was. I put the document in the folder. I drove back to Portland. 3 days later, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "There's something I need to tell you," I said. "I filed a document with the county last week." There was a pause. "What kind of document?" she said. "A life estate provision. Grandma had it drawn up in 2011. It names me as a protected party on the Vineyard parcel. I filed it on October 3rd. The pause that came after that was longer. The particular quality of that silence. I had heard it before from her, but never quite in that register. It was the sound of something being recalculated. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I know," I said. "I'll send you a copy." I let it sit. "I'll send Carol Dryden's contact information too," I said. "She's the attorney handling this." I heard Diane's breathing, the refrigerator hum of her kitchen. "Lena," she said. "I'll send it tonight," I said. "Take your time reading it." I ended the call and set the phone on the counter. Through the window, I could see the street below, people walking, a delivery truck double parked, an ordinary Thursday afternoon in the city. I thought about the Madeline block. I thought about the way the mist sat in the low places between the rows on October mornings. I thought about my grandmother pressing 2 fingers into the soil and waiting.
I didn't sleep well that night.
But it was not the sleep of someone who had done something wrong. Carol Dryden called me on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of October. She said Diane's attorney had been in touch. His name was Gerald Foss, and he had been the family's estate attorney for 11 years. The same attorney who had handled Opal's probate, the same attorney who had apparently facilitated the December transfer without raising the question of whether a prior protected interest might exist on the parcel. Carol said his tone on the phone had been measured. She said the word he used most often was clarification. "He's asking for a meeting," she said. "All parties." When I said, he suggested 2 weeks. His office in Bellingham. I was at my desk when she called. It was a gray October morning, and the light through the east window had that particular quality it gets in the Pacific Northwest in autumn. Not dark exactly, but weighted, like the sky was holding something it hadn't decided to put down yet. "Tell him yes," I said. "There may be an attempt to negotiate," Carol said. "To reach a settlement that doesn't require a quiet title action. I want you to know that's possible and that it's worth hearing out. But you are under no obligation to accept any offer that doesn't fully recognize your interest in the parcel." I said I understood. She said she would send confirmation. I put the phone down and sat for a while. I thought about Ryan standing in the doorway. I thought about Diane's voice on the February call, the most logical structure going forward, and the way she had said it without a tremor, without the smallest acknowledgement that I might have a different understanding of what was logical. I thought about a conversation I'd had with Opal when I was 19, driving back from a county fair in her truck, the late summer evening coming down over the valley. She had said something that I had filed away without fully understanding it, the way you file things when you're 19 and the person saying them is old enough to mean it in a way you can't yet access. She said, "The hardest thing about land is that everybody wants to be the one who kept it, even the ones who let someone else do the keeping." I hadn't thought about that sentence in years. I thought about it now. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder of scanned documents. Every tax receipt, every contractor invoice, every frost protection maintenance log. I went through them one more time, not because I needed to verify anything, but because I needed to look at the number of years they represented laid out in sequence. The folder contained records spanning 11 years. 43 separate documents. A total of $47,218 in expenses I had absorbed from my own accounts, not counting my labor hours. I closed the folder. I let it sit. 2 weeks was enough time. I had everything I needed. I had had everything I needed since the night I sat at my kitchen table and read the 4th page of the life estate provision for the first time. The meeting in Bellingham was on a Thursday at 10 in the morning. Gerald Foss's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building 2 blocks from the waterfront, with large north-facing windows that let in a flat, even light. There was a conference table with 8 chairs. When Carol and I arrived, Gerald was already there, and Diane was seated to his left, and Ryan was in the chair beside her. Ryan had a pen in his hand. He was turning it between his fingers the way people do when they are not sure what to do with their hands. Diane was dressed in a charcoal blazer. Her hands were folded on the table. She looked at me when I came in, and her face made the careful arrangement it always made. Not hostile, not warm, the managed expression of someone who has decided in advance how this is going to go. I set my folder on the table and sat down. Gerald opened the meeting by explaining that the purpose was to explore whether a resolution could be reached without litigation. He said this pleasantly. He acknowledged that the life estate provision was a valid instrument under Washington state law. He said this less pleasantly. He then proposed that the parties consider a buyout arrangement, that Ryan would compensate me for my protected interest at a figure reflecting current market valuation. Carol said we were willing to hear a number. Gerald said the number they were proposing was $85,000. The room was quiet for a moment. I looked at the surface of the conference table. It was a dark wood, walnut maybe, with a fine grain. Someone had polished it recently, and the overhead light made a long, flat reflection across its surface. The parcel's assessed value is $1.4 million, Carol said. The protected interest represents a partial claim, not full ownership, Gerald said. The proposed figure reflects that partial nature. My client's interest is not partial, Carol said. The provision does not create a fractional interest. It creates a protected right that makes any transfer without consent void. The December transfer is currently void. That is not a fractional situation. Diane unfolded her hands and refolded them.
Lena, she said.
I looked at her. Your grandmother would not have wanted this, she said. A legal proceeding. The family in a conference room with attorneys. You know that. I let the sentence settle. She wanted the land to go to the people who worked it, I said. That's what she told me. In March of 2011, 2 weeks before she had the provision drawn up. Diane was quiet. She showed me the cedar box, I said. She explained the provision. She told me the land should know its own people. Ryan set his pen down on the table. You took the box, he said. It was the first thing he had said since I walked in. I did, I said. That was not yours to take. She gave me the provision, I said. She explained it to me. She showed me where she kept it. I took the box when nobody else was paying attention to what was in it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the table. Diane said, We've tried to be fair to you, Lena. The contribution you made to the property over the years. No one is denying that. But your brother has been stepping up. He's been present. He wasn't present for the frost in January 2022, I said. I drove up at 4 in the morning. He was in Seattle. I have the drive log. She stopped. He wasn't present for the February 2020 pruning, or the 2021 tax payment, or the irrigation header repair in the spring of 2022. I have the invoice. I have the receipt. I have 43 documents in this folder covering 11 years. I opened the folder and slid the tab stack to the center of the table. Nobody reached for it immediately. Gerald looked at the stack. He looked at Carol. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a retreat, but a recalibration. Perhaps, he said, we should take a short break. They came back with a different number after 20 minutes. The new number was $340,000, matching, deliberately, the transfer value that had been recorded in December. A settlement, structured as a deed amendment restoring my co-title on the parcel, plus a formal operating agreement that recognized my role in the vineyard's management. Carol leaned toward me. "It's not a quiet title win," she said quietly, "but it's your name back on the deed. And it's an operating agreement." I looked at the document Gerald had placed on the table. Then I reached into the folder. I took out the life estate provision, the original, 4 pages, Opal's signature on page 4 with a notary stamp in blue ink. I laid it flat on the table between us. I turned to the second page and set my finger below the operative clause. No conveyance, transfer, assignment, or encumbrance of the subject parcel shall be effective as against the protected interest of the named party, without the express written consent of said party, duly executed and notarized. My grandmother signed this in March of 2011, I said. She explained it to me. She kept it for 11 years. I've had it since January of 2020. It was filed with Skagit County on October 3rd. I looked at Diane. "You told me the transfer was the most logical structure going forward," I said. "You told me you were being fair to me. You told me Grandma would not have wanted this." She held my gaze. "What Grandma wanted," I said, "is on page 4. I did not raise my voice. I did not look away. "I'm going to accept the deed amendment and the operating agreement," I said. "Not because the offer is fair, Carol can explain why it isn't, but because I'm not interested in spending the next 2 years in litigation over land I've already been working for 11. I want my name on the deed. I want the operating agreement in writing. And I want the document executed and filed before I leave this building." I stood. "You said no one was denying my contribution," I said to Diane. "The operating agreement is how that stops being something you say in a conference room and starts being something that exists." I picked up the life estate provision and slid it back into the folder. I sat back down and folded my hands on the table. "Whenever you're ready," I said. The document was executed at 12:47 in the afternoon. Gerald's assistant notarized it. Carol kept the original. I was given a certified copy, which I placed in the folder between the life estate provision and the 2019 tax receipt. We were out of the building by 1 o'clock. Carol and I walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks from the waterfront. She ordered an Americano. I ordered a plain drip coffee. We sat at a table by the window and I looked out at the gray October water while she went through the next steps, filing the deed amendment, establishing the operating agreement's effective date, setting the schedule for the first formal co-management review in the spring. I listened, and I answered her questions, and I looked at the water. After a while she said, "You knew this was going to work." It wasn't a question, exactly. I knew the document was valid, I said. I didn't know what they'd do with it. "You weren't surprised by anything in there." I thought about it. "I was surprised by the pen," I said. She looked at me. "My brother had a pen in his hand when I walked in," I said. "Like he was already signing something." I hadn't expected that. Carol looked at me for a moment, and then she looked at her coffee. 11 years is a long time, she said. "It is," I said. I drove back to Portland in the early afternoon, the valley opening up to the south through the windshield. The light was better by then. The weighted gray had lifted, and there was actual sun on the ridge to the east, the kind of low October sun that makes the vine rows throw long shadows across the ground between them. I thought about what Opal had said in the truck, the late summer evening coming back from the fair. Everybody wants to be the one who kept it, even the ones who let someone else do the keeping. The land had its name now, the right name, the one that had been there since March of 2011, waiting in a cedar box with a green-edged brass clasp, patient the way land is patient, not passive, not resigned, but certain in the way that things rooted deeply in the ground are certain. It did not need me to be loud about it. It only needed me to show up. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that these stories don't always end with the bigger number or the loudest moment. They end with the thing that was true the whole time finally becoming visible. The deed amendment is filed. My name is on the parcel. The operating agreement runs through the next harvest. I'll be in the valley in February for the dormancy pruning, same as I've been for 11 years, Same rows, same early morning cold, same smell of cut wood that I've never been able to explain to anyone who hasn't stood in a vineyard and done the work. The cedar box is still in the back room of the farmhouse. I put it back on the shelf when I was there last month. I left the life estate provision inside it, in the sealed envelope with Opal's handwriting. Some things belong where they started. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the one who showed up while someone else got the credit, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. It takes less than a minute, and it means more than you know. I'm Lena. I'll see you in the next one. Part 2. 1,985 words written to this point/budget, 3,238 minimum. Floor not yet met. Expanding via flashback/reflection depth in Act 5. No new scenes. No new escalation cycles. Expanding Act 5. Quiet decision period. Flashback beat. In the days between filing the provision and the Bellingham meeting, I drove up to the vineyard once more. I didn't tell anyone I was going. It wasn't a strategic visit. I wasn't checking on anything specific, wasn't planning to document anything or photograph anything for Carol's file. I went because the harvest was coming in that week, and I had been present for every harvest for 11 years, and I was not going to stop being present because a piece of paper in a county file said someone else's name. I arrived on a Wednesday evening just before dusk. The winery crew was finishing for the day. They were doing the Pinot block, Opal's block, the one she had planted after my grandfather died. I parked at the bottom of the lane and walked up, without going to the farmhouse. I went directly to the block and stood at the end of a row and watched the last of the crew work their way out. The Pinot vines in October are a particular color, a deep, settled burgundy at the leaf tips that bleeds back into green toward the stem, as if the vine is deciding something at its edges. Opal had described this color once as the vine closing its accounts for the year, which was such a precise and unsentimental thing to say that I had written it down in the small notebook I kept on the farm table the summer she said it. I still had the notebook. It was in the same folder as the provision. I stood at the end of the row until the crew had gone, and the light had fallen completely behind the ridge, and the first chill of the evening came in off the lower fields. The valley at night in October is a specific kind of quiet, not silent, because there is always the sound of water somewhere, and the particular sound of wind through dormant vine canes, a low dry rattle that is nothing like the sound of leaves, but quiet in the way that places are quiet when they are not performing for anyone. I didn't walk the rows that evening. I just stood at the end of the block and let the quiet settle around me, and I thought about what it meant to have worked a piece of ground for 11 years and to have it finally, formally, reflect what had been true the whole time. I thought about the winter of 2022, the frost drive, arriving at 4 in the morning with my truck headlights sweeping across the near edge of Block A and the frost already visible on the cane tips, white and crystalline in the beam. I thought about the specific sequence of actions I had taken that morning, where I had gone first, which valves I had opened, what order I had checked the emitter heads in, and how none of that sequence was visible in any document, in any filing, in any county record. It was just labor, absorbed into the ground, invisible the way most labor is invisible. But the vines remembered it, in the way that vines remember, in the health of the wood, in the quality of the fruit, in the way the Madeline block came through that January with only the outer row showing damage while the interior held clean. I had stood in that same spot in February in the cold after the frost and looked at the clean interior rows, and I had not felt anything I could name exactly. It was more like a fact becoming visible. The work held. Standing there in October, in the dark, 2 weeks before the Bellingham meeting, I felt something like that again. The work held. I walked back to my truck. I drove back to Portland. I slept well that night. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and it is the thing I find myself thinking about most when I go back over the whole sequence of events. At some point in the summer before Opal died, she was sick by then, though not yet in the way that made the sickness visible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. She called me from the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon. I was in Portland. She called on the landline, which she always preferred. She said she had been going through the cedar box and she wanted to make sure I remembered what was in it. I said I remembered. She said, "The provision is there. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't." I said I wouldn't. She said, "You'll know when you need it." Then she said she was going to make dinner and she would talk to me on Thursday, which was our regular call day. She died 11 weeks later. On a Tuesday in September, At 6 in the morning, when the valley would have been in its particular early light and the mist would have been sitting in the low places between the rows. I have thought about that Sunday phone call many times. She called to remind me the document was there. She did not call to tell me what to do with it or when to use it or how the legal mechanism worked. She called to make sure I knew it existed. You'll know when you need it. She was right. I did know. I had known from the moment I sat at my kitchen table in February and heard my mother say the title has been updated to reflect that in the voice she used for decisions that were already settled. Some things are planted a long time before they're needed. That doesn't make them less present. It makes them more precise.